everyone. Welcome to today's episode on BRSR reporting preparedness and case studies. I would like to thank everyone for taking the time and joining us today. I am Simoni Rathod from Ludhain Company ESG Practice. Ludhain Company is an 80-year-old assurance and advisory firm with 6 offices all over the country. Today is the fifth and the final episode of the webinar series on ESG reporting on Indian corporates. In our previous episodes, we discussed the various data points of BRSR reporting, the history of NGRBCs, the framing of policies and procedures for ESG reporting, the role of G in ESG integration. Today, we will understand how to move towards ESG reporting and discuss the various parameters and the BRSR reports that are filed by pharma, finance, and FMCG company. The purpose of the webinar is purely for educational purposes, and any kind of compliance decision shall be referred to a professional advisor. In case of any questions during the session, attendees can raise their hands or post them in the live chat box, where we will be happy to address them after the session. Attendees are also requested to stay on mute at all times during the session. ESG reporting is a form of public reporting by an organization's management team about its performance across a variety of environmental, social, and governance issues. The primary consumers of ESG data are investment and finance communities who consume the data via the ESG rating platform that develops an ESG score, which helps the users to benchmark performance and compare one company with another. As the world is becoming more ESG savvy, prospective consumers, employees, supply chain partners also require ESG data, by way of which they make decisions about the types of organizations they wish to conduct their business and work for. And finally, the regulators and other government agencies, like we have SEBI, that require filing of BRSR report by the top 1,000 listed companies. This kind of reporting is required by the government agencies to ensure that every business operates in a responsible manner. Now, many companies are doing great things with regard to their ESG strategies, but they are not clearly able to communicate their performance to the stakeholders. So here, it's very important to have a ESG reporting strategy. In order to have the ESG reporting strategy, first, the entity needs to understand its current situation that it is in. So where a company resides in developing and deploying its ESG strategy, it impacts the ability and readiness to report publicly on the ESG factors. The company leaders should find out the various matrix to report, to share, and to disclose, and also decide on which ESG reporting framework to use to report the information. As per the current scenario, the ESG reporting landscape lacks agreed upon standards, which results in reports that are inconsistent, unreliable, incomparable with other organizations. So it is very important to develop a good reporting strategy, which will help the entities to ensure that their stakeholders will acknowledge their company's ESG efforts. As the India INC is moving towards ESG reporting, it is very important for the reporting entities to understand the various elements of a high quality ESG report. So the first and foremost important element is identification of risk. So an ESG report should highlight the important areas and the potential events and threats that the entities that might face that could impact the entity's competitive advantage, reputation, compliance, environment, operations, or financial health. The ESG report should also highlight not only the risks, but also the opportunities. Like the opportunities shall be the potential areas where the entity may be able to innovate and introduce new products or penetrate new markets. For example, the opportunity could be to reduce GHG emissions or improve their sustainable or governance matrix. Another thing is to deal with the risk and opportunities, the entities need to report on the strategies that they have come up with to deal with. So basically, strategies refer to a roadmap that the top management has decided on which consists the structure, the budgeting, the timeline. Apart from that, the data that the entity is mentioning in the report has to be very unambiguous, and a clear representation of the efforts should be shown and the progress of the entity towards the sustainability goals. So this section should be heavy on the matrix that the entity has decided on. The matrix should be both improving period over period and improving relative to the entity's peer group. The main thumb rule for ESG reporting and creating ESG reports should be high levels of standardization and accuracy. Now, I would like to pass on the virtual floor to Mr. Manishankar Prasad. Mr. Manishankar Prasad has over 14 years of experience in the environmental and social consulting background from across 10 countries in Asia and Africa. He is currently the Vice President of Lodha & Company ESG practice.
Hi, evening, afternoon, and morning to all of you who are attending this webinar, and thank you so much for being here with us this time around, and Happy New Year to all of you. Well, many thanks, Simone, for the introduction, for the context which you have kind of juxtaposed ESG reporting into the various important parameters which are relevant to ESG reporting. But how do we actually do a ESG report? And BRSR is an Indian variant of an ESG report. So any kind of ESG report which has to be done from a reporting perspective has to first establish what are the parameters which are needed to report in the first case. Second of all, how do we actually assess our requirements? How do we assess the organizational requirements in order to meet our ESG objectives or strategies? Because ESG is not done in a vacuum. ESG is done in order to meet capital requirements, in order to meet consumer requirements, in order to meet compliance requirements. So the 3 C's are, of course, in place. So after we assess how the matrices are needed for the ESG report to take place, how do we actually design and implement the strategy then? How do we actually place in context the bespoke framework which is needed for ESG reporting in the first place for an organization? And how do we actually collect the data, clean the data, and actually report as per its timeliness, as per its validity, in the service of the business strategy? Because ESG is, of course, relevant to business, and everything which is in perspective to ESG is relevant to risk and opportunities, as my panelists have suggested. So after we design and implement the reporting strategy in place, how do we sustain it? How do we ensure that month on month, year on year, quarter on quarter, the reporting takes place? How do we ensure that the data sets from various departments, various silos, at the point of the need, vis-a-vis whichever framework it is, it is BRSR, whether it is so it's not a one-stop solution, right? It's not an annual or a quarter event. It is a monthly or a daily event which takes place on a day-to-day basis, and reporting is not an end result. Reporting is indeed very much a journey that an organization takes place. So after you report, how do you ensure that you have validity and credibility of what you report? You carry out assurance by a third party auditor, by an assurance agency, a consultant, which makes sure that whatever you have reported is actually not greenwashing. It actually is relevant with the evidence trail in place. So there are, of course, assurance standards in place for sustainability like AA1000 and other ISO standards which an organization can draw upon. And one of the most emerging ESG bucket areas is indeed ESG assurance, because Investors are heavily reliant on what you report for the decision making. So how do you increase, how do you ramp up the trust levels over there? Next slide, please. Okay, so how do we actually establish what we have to report? The first step, how do we actually know what to report, is actually carrying out an stakeholder materiality assessment. Materiality assessment is basically those factors which are environmental, social in nature, which are imperative for your business continuity. In very, very simple terms, why is materiality very important? Because ESG is an omnibus umbrella concept in which there are about 100 odd indicators. Each rating agency diverges, and there is a data, there is an enormous amount of data which is produced, which might not be relevant for an organization. The indicators might not be relevant for a service organization or for a manufacturing company. Not all the factors are important, right? So you need to carry out what is important for you. In order to know what is important for you, you need to carry out a materiality assessment, which is essentially a risk and opportunities mapping, which allows you to understand what you need to communicate to your audience and what do you need to report, what are your matrices. And in order to report what you need to report, you need to know what are the frameworks you need to benchmark yourself as per, and what are the timelines for reporting. What indicators are important for you? For example, there is a general thumb rule in the ESG business that 1/3 is E, 1/3 is S, 1/3 is G. But it, but for a, but for an industrial organization, uh, E might be much bigger than S. Or for example, for a service-led organization, it might be the case that S is bigger than the E. So this comes out from the story, what you map out as far as your materiality is concerned. So these are, we need to understand what is your materiality according to your stakeholder engagement map. What are stakeholders? Stakeholders are basically individuals or groups who are concerned or impacted by the activities of your business. So, so why is stakeholder mapping important? You need to understand what is the level of influence that they carry out on your business, or vice versa, and how are they important in your reporting strategy? For example, why do we report? We report to build trust. So we need to build trust with civil society actors, with regulators, with business partners, and also with the media. And a large part of ESG is about communication. What do you actually need to communicate to the media? So all these factors all tie in ultimately into what you essentially need to create a conceptual framework for yourself, into what you want to report ultimately. And that's the starting point. And that's why it's called strategy, right? Strategy is always which looks forward to the future, which is future facing in nature. And ESG is very much future facing because it's about sustainability. Next slide, please. So, so you need to assess what you need to report. So reporting, what do you need to report? You need to report what is relevant to your company, right? According to your stakeholders. Materiality is, of course, a filter upon what you want to report, as I've just mentioned. But it is also important to assess who is important to you as far as business continuity is concerned. So, for example, uh, is your primary audience your shareholders, your investor community, or your consumers, or your employees? In our experience, all of your stakeholders, whether these are the shareholders or investors or your employees or your vendors, all of them are important to some degree or the other. So what you need to report is important to all of these stakeholders. Of course, a sustainability report or an ESG report or a BRSR report will be read by different communities through their unique lens. For example, if I'm an investor and analyst sitting at a fund, I will look at it from an investment perspective, from a risk perspective. What are the opportunities which are there if I invest in this particular organization? Or, for example, if I'm a regulator, I will look at it from a compliance perspective, from a risk perspective, but from a public risk perspective. So if I'm a consumer, if I'm looking at the RSR report, I will look at it from a non-compliance perspective, right? Have they received any complaints from the consumers, or have they received complaints from the supply chain, for example? So what you need to report is also determined by who looks at your report. So this is what the anchoring of the assess element of the reporting strategy is concerned. Is it an internal assessment? Yes, it's an internal assessment, and these are processes and procedures which has to be developed in place within the organization as far as the ESG data management system is concerned. Because as I mentioned, your reporting doesn't take place at the end of a quarter or of a financial year. It takes place on a day-to-day basis. Your carbon is measured on a daily basis based on the amount of fuel that is consumed, for example. Or, for example, how much of electricity are you drawing from the grid, or how much of water are you using? Because water is an important metric in the BRSR report in the section C in Principle 6, which covers environmental determinants. So these are the controls in place which we need to have. How do we actually manage data system? You use technology, you use a SaaS system, or you use an ERP in place and plug a good ESG data management process in place. So a very important role of technology has to be there, because data is the very basis of communication. And when you have data, you have IT, you have digital, you have technology in place. Next slide, please. So once you know what to report, right? Once you have established what you need and what are the requirements of your stakeholders in place, you need to design a system and you need to implement it in place. So you need to describe your governance framework, the board oversight of relevant ESG issues in your company's reporting. For example, if you have an ESG committee on your board, or if you have a CSR committee which is doing the ESG oversight at the moment, or any other committee. For smaller organizations, it can be the entire board looking after ESG. So it depends upon the scale and the complexity of your organization, who determines the compliance function from the board level, as ESG is a board issue, as we have been ranting and speaking about all the time in the media at the moment. But who looks after your ultimate direction is determined by your board. It is determined by them. So do you allocate the ESG to one committee or to the entire board is again the call of the organization. You have to determine what are your ESG objectives. Where do you want to go? Do you want to be a net zero company? Do you want to be a water neutral company? What are the metrics do you need to communicate that story ultimately? Data is our story. What do you need to communicate in order to serve your story? So do you have the internal controls in place to measure, monitor, and internally verify ESG performance, as well as the relevant disclosure controls? Identify the various reporting standards and frameworks which are available along with the current regulatory required reporting, which is we have an alphabet soup of frameworks in place. Of course, we are reaching an interoperability of ESG disclosure standards through the ISSB, through the IFRS, and ultimately we will reach that point in the next 1 or 2 years. But right now it is very, very messy and complex for organizations having to look at SBTI, SSB, GRI, and integrated reporting. So where do you actually start? How do you actually report? And it is not only important to know what to communicate, but also to look at what frameworks will suit your story rather than the other way around. So how do you build a data collection process that is of sufficient quality and which is fit for purpose for external compliance? But by the way, ESG assurance is not compulsory many a time, including the RSR for this year, but it might be compulsory for subsequent years, as well as there is an element in the BRSR report which says that has your data being assured. So assurance is already built in as a part of the compliance story. Next slide, please. So how do you actually sustain the entire ESG journey? So strategy is only good if you do it on a regular basis, if you implement it on diligently, if you report it with data which is quantifiable, which is relevant, which is timely, which is verifiable. Verifiable is very, very important. That's where the assurance element comes into the picture. And is your data understood so these are measured, but these are backed up by suitable SOPs, suitable methodological frameworks, and these are very, very important to have these in place so that data quality is maintained and assured. For example, for carbon, there are various frameworks by the CDP, by TCFD, which call for data being reported in particular formats, particular procedures, to ensure that the data is credible and viable and worthy to be reported. So it's also important to make sure that the uh, the data is relevant, and for that, whether there are additional controls in place, whether there are checks and balances in place in order to sustain the reporting journey. The disclosure landscape, as I mentioned, is of data deluge. There are multiple sustainability frameworks. So one way to ensure that the disclosure landscape is congruent to your story and to your goals is to make sure that what is relevant to your stakeholders, what is material to your business objectives. Because ultimately, ESG is about business, it's about meeting your requirements to your external stakeholder engagement, although the values might seem very internal. Next. Okay, so as far as assurance goes, assurance lends credibility and validity, as I mentioned. So as far as uh, assurance is relevant, is as we all know, as watchers of the ESG space, there is the corporate sustainability reporting disclosures, which have detailed requirements for assurance, for example, as a part of EU taxonomy, is fairly common because instruments, volatility, carbon markets, for example, if you need to balance your carbon budget, you in order to certify that these are the carbon credits which you want to trade vis-a-vis your carbon emissions, or if you're carbon positive, you would like to trade them for a sum in a carbon market, which is very common in Singapore, or for example, carbon borders are being set up in the EU at this point of time, where products and companies exporting to the EU would have to map their carbon budget for their particular products, conducting LCA and carbon footprint. As far as the European requirements are concerned, uh, it is partially mandatory as of now, but it will be completely mandatory from the time going forward, honestly speaking, because assurance is about trust, and ESG is also about trust and transparency for responsible capitalism. So over there, assurance plays a monumental, if not a mandatory role in the entire story, and the EU is certainly uh, setting the bar for that. Next slide, please. So we are now moving forward from the construct, the concept, the framework to actual case studies, what it actually means to set up a ESG reporting strategy. So if we take up a case study of a FMCG organization for the period of 21-22, which is essentially the RSR report, what is the reporting boundary for this? The reporting boundaries are on a standalone basis for the organization, but the material issues which are identified are GHG, which is a risk, waste management, which is an opportunity if you do it as a part of circular economy. Human rights is, of course, a risk for an FMCG company because you take ingredients and products from vendors across the world. Supply chain is an opportunity. Product lifecycle assessment is an opportunity. And over here, this FMCG company has set ESG targets vis-a-vis carbon, plastic, hazardous waste, and it also, as FMCG companies have a lot of plastic and packaging waste, they have an extended producer responsibility framework in mind, which they have to report to the Central Pollution Control Board, CPCB, in Delhi. They have also implemented a safety management system, which is OSHA 18K. And circular economy is important from an FMCG perspective because there's a lot of waste being generated, and life cycle assessment do certainly add to the same. And FMCG companies are normally very being captured in terms of monetary value if they do recycling, or for example, if they do circular economy measures in a productive manner. Next case study, please. So we move from FMCG to a financial organization. Reporting period remains the same. Reporting boundary over here is consolidated basis. The material issues which are identified for this are climate change vulnerability, which is both a risk and an opportunity. How is it is a risk? It is a risk because it might lend to an organization which has substantial exposure in a flood-prone zone. How is it an opportunity? It might devise innovative financial products which might help finance climate adaptation, for example, or retrofitting in terms of energy efficiency. Consumer experience is, of course, a risk because as a client-facing business, any negative feedback can be reported in the BRSR. Financial inclusion is an opportunity because a lot of people in India are unbanked. So this organization has in fact reported on scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. For example, it has implemented a health and safety management system. It has also enabled e-waste recycling system. So it is doing all the right things. But as far as the financial organization is concerned, I think so a major trigger over here is of course consumer experience. Of course, there might be consumers which are not very happy, but it also might be a platform for nation building in terms of bringing the unbanked into the financial inclusion fold which India has the India Stack through Aadhaar, uh, through these various technology platforms which these organizations are are being implemented through policies of the state, and and it's very important to have financial inclusion in place from a perspective, from a climate reporting perspective of financial organization. Indeed. Next case study. So pharmaceutical organizations are a bit of anomaly. Why is it an anomaly? There are about 170 odd companies which have reported the BRS are voluntarily until last month. So about 10 companies are pharma companies out of that. Pharma companies are unique because they are the product of a compliance culture. FDA or the EU, they do monthly, quarterly audits on a regular basis for organizations who export to these Western markets. So they are very used to compliances. So BRSR is nothing new. BRSR is an add-on to to the entire compliance story, which they do on a regular basis. And they have large compliance departments, whether it is regulatory compliance or whether it is pharma compliance. So they have all kinds of teams in place. Companies like Cipla, for example, have done integrated reporting, which captures impact, not only captures compliance, but it also captures impact, strategy, all in the same space. So, so the material issues which are identified are compliance. Compliance is a big risk for a pharmaceutical organization. Regulatory compliance is a risk as well. Risk is a total risk, but these are opportunities as well. Opportunities can be support to communities, for example, through health education and prevention. Responsible supply chain is, of course, a risk, but they have abundant opportunities for CSR, for example, for community development measures, which a lot of these pharmaceutical companies do. Climate change is both a risk and an opportunity because there is a more than adequate scope for technological advancement over there. There are so many aspects to risk for a pharmaceutical company that, but paradoxically, they are a very risk-led, risk-centric business. So compliances often are cascaded to competitive advantage, and they do extremely important work as far as nation building is concerned, because as we have seen through the pandemic, a lot of these pharmaceutical companies were a part of protecting the country to the virus, as well as also supporting global supply chains from India. So as far as health and safety compliance is concerned, they have all the compliances in place, which is 45K, 18K for health and safety. They have commitments towards water consumption, carbon, and also hazardous waste. All plastic waste is recycled, which is great. Heat capture is taken care of. There are initiatives for that. So pharmaceutical companies are usually on the frontier of, of, of building compliance systems, and BRSR is nothing new. BRSR only helps them to report their data and the story in a cohesive manner. Next slide, please. So the next part of the presentation is how do we communicate our reporting in the best possible manner. So ESG reporting doesn't have a one size fits all framework for ESG. So companies can adopt a comply or explain approach to ESG reporting, because there might be an indicator on the BRSR report which is considered not material to its operations, and the entity might not choose to disclose it because it's not required, but it can mention why it is not material to the business. So in order to meet the comply or explain requirement, as far as the TCFD recommendations are concerned, TCFD actually, in terms of climate and carbon, it tries to push the bar in terms of doing scenario analysis, because climate risk is twofold. Climate risk is physical risk, which is flooding risk or heat risk to your business, or it is transition risk in terms of whether your businesses will be impacted by the entire transition story. Will your products become uncompetitive, or do you have to do any major capital refurbishment of your business in order to maintain competitiveness? So these are two kinds of risk which are addressed uh, by TCFD as far as the scenario analysis is concerned. And scenario analysis is not a perfect tool, but it is a very useful tool for businesses to start thinking about risk in a productive manner. In fact, the difference between CDP and TCFD is that TCFD is far more future facing rather than only compliance driven. Next slide, please. So as far as the best practices or next practices is concerned, it is important to engage stakeholders. So, so your stakeholder map can be internal and external, right? So it can be within your organization in terms of corporate communications, investor relations, human resource, government relations, compliance, etc., etc. But it is also very important to reduce your list of stakeholders to a workable size, to a size which is optimum to your ESG compliance requirements or reporting requirements. So you need to have only those people who are mandatory for your inherent business requirements, rather than anybody and everybody joining the group. So there are effective stakeholder engagement methods, of course, based on your interest and in terms of influence abilities of the stakeholders. So these can be written comments or responses. This can be roundtable discussions. This can be annual general body meetings. These can be workshops, advisory committees, or surveys, or even focus groups, which are conducted from time to time in order to map perception. Why do we do stakeholder consultation? Is to build a buy-in, first of all, but also it is also to gauge the pulse of the community vis-a-vis ESG, right? So very common technique nowadays used by organizations to map their ESG efforts is to do sentiment analysis. Is to do sentiment analysis of your ESG efforts in social media. So they do social listening, they do participatory listening from your social media groups and in terms of your communities in order to map whether your ESG communication is working or not. So this is the next frontier of reporting. It might not be compliance, but it will be far more real-time and dynamic manner using digital. Next slide, please. So last but not the least, how do you actually set these ESG targets? One simple, rather straightforward way is the acronym called SMART, which is specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. So how do you set these ESG targets? What do you want to achieve? To start off with, how will you know if you have achieved the target? Is the target which you have mentioned or conceived is attainable, or how do you actually achieve it or attain it? How is it relevant to your reporting strategy in the first place? And is the target meaningful in a time-bound manner? So these smart strategy or smart strategy towards what can be measured is what can be managed, as the acronym goes, as the maxim goes, regarding ESG reporting strategy is important, and these are cascaded onto BRSR or any other ESG reporting strategy which an organization wants to deliver. So I end my presentation over here, and thank you all for your time. I would I will pass the floor to Simoni to take the conversation forward.
Attendees are now requested to take a poll that we'll be launching in short while. Thank you everyone for attending the poll. Attendees can now post their questions in the live chat box or raise their hands or write to us at esg@dodaco.com.
Please feel free to raise your hand or lob your probe in to the chat box. We are looking forward to having a conversation. We will wait for a couple of minutes more in case the attendees have any probes. We would encourage the attendees to write into us in case they have any follow-up question. We will be having other webinars on topics of materiality, stakeholder engagement, reporting boundaries, and value chains in the subsequent series of our webinar. This was particularly in relation to BRSR and ESG reporting, but we have other webinars on specific topics regarding ESG being lined up from next week onwards. So please feel free to write into us for any feedback, and please do attend our subsequent webinars. We are looking forward to your participation. And we do have a YouTube channel in place in which we have previous webinars which are there, and you can have a look at them. And this webinar as well will be on a YouTube channel very soon, to have a complete perspective on what we have discussed over the past 5 weeks. Shimoni, do you have any follow-ups or any thoughts in order to close the series and the webinar today?
Thank you, sir, for giving us your insights over how to understand and take steps towards ESG reporting. I also thank everyone for attending the webinar on BRSR preparedness and case studies. On behalf of Lodha & Company, I would like to wish everyone a very happy, healthy, wealthy, and prosperous new year. Thank you.